Good morning, everybody. My name is Roger Wilkinson, and I'm the Digital Publications Editor for TASA. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. Today, I have the privilege of introducing both Andrew Jakubowicz and Catherine Hastings, and they're going to be talking on a transition to a sociologist in private practice. So both of them come from very different perspectives and different backgrounds and different career trajectories. So I'll pass it over to Andrew, who is going to talk first. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Roger. And I'm speaking from the land of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging on unceded land. Thanks, everyone, for turning up, and hopefully it'll be an interesting engagement. I'm really looking forward to hearing Catherine. We've had some preliminary discussions, and I'm very interested in the trajectory. But essentially what we've decided we try and do today is look at two, I suppose, intersecting but opposite travelling arcs of life. I'm clearly slightly older than Catherine, seriously older than Catherine. I've been around, I was thinking actually, my first sociology exercise, because I wasn't initially trained as a sociologist, David, you'll be happy to hear, was teaching a class on Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft to first year students in Sociology 1 in 1970 at the University of New South Wales. And my memory is there were 720 students in that class, in that lecture theatre. And I had to both vaguely present that I knew what I was talking about and hopefully keep them entertained. And given that I was a political scientist rather than a sociologist, it was a very rapid run, but I'm sure many of us have had that sort of experience. So what I wanted to do was talk about my transition out of academe, and Catherine will be talking about her transition, I guess, into academe. So we can see the sort of two things that are going on. If you're happy, I'll share my screen. There we go. See how that goes. Yes, is that sharing, everyone? It's hard to know exactly what I'm. Yes, there we go. Fantastic. Yeah. So when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of one of my supervisors many moons ago, a Marxist, in fact Maoist professor of sociology in the UK, who kept reminding us all that academic jobs were the last remnant of feudal petty commodity production. And that the thing we had to understand was that we all had our little plot and we would defend it to the death. And that's what we lived off. And I remember many times sort of thinking through what that might mean, particularly as academia has moved into, I guess, called the late capitalist, into sort of a late capitalist period, almost sort of post-capitalist, not post-capitalist, late capitalist mode of production, where the nature of academic work is being very much transformed. And there are small plots still of privately tendered knowledge creation, but many more of us have been caught up in this vast transformation of it. I sort of discovered, I guess, that I was outlasting the value proposition that I presented. And I jokingly said to Roger when we were talking about this that I knew that the writing was on the wall when my boss took me out to lunch and bought me a hamburger. And I thought that's probably in many ways a very significant statement about the world moving on. So I formally left academe in 2017. This is about 4 years ago now. And with the expectation, I guess, of most people in that situation that I continue to think and hopefully produce stuff. I would get back into some of the stuff I really loved, like painting and artwork. And my partner and I would travel a lot. You may recall that by the beginning of 2020, travelling was really not happening anymore. Everything came to a great halt, and I had time to pause and reflect. And I don't know how many of you are across or engaged with the work of Kathy Sharma, who I guess has been identified as a creator of constructivist grounded theory. But when she was doing her major work on illness and health and death and dying and so on, the sort of symbolic interactionist approach to it, she made the comment that you are what you do. And that stuck in my mind then and became very much part of a sense of what would happen next. What would I actually, who I would be, what my identity would be, who I might be as a human being, what my relationships might look like, all of those things were a function of what I would actually do about it. And I knew that I wanted to probe some of the things also that Sharma's was interested in, the conditions under which injustice or justice develops, changes and continues. And also recognise my own subjectivity in that as a very privileged white male who entered the university system at exactly the right moment, who survived and did well, and who came out of it in fairly reasonable shape, and suffered very few of the severe traumas and challenges that younger colleagues today are facing in the constantly changing environment where the social sciences are being very much smashed about by universities and government and so on. So I returned to art school, which was a very challenging experience, basically learning how to draw and paint. And then I started to get some requests from colleagues that I should come on board for projects. My last big project at the university had been a sort of 6 or 7 year ARC linkage covering 6 or 7 or 8, it was impossible to tell, different universities. And I made a vow that never again in my whole life would I ever go anywhere near anything like that. That wasn't a difficult vow to keep, but I did a little bit of stuff. And then I guess along came the pandemic, and the pandemic I know has changed lots of things for people in many different ways. But for me, it suddenly cast me very dramatically into the field of private practice. I was worrying at the pandemic. I live in Coogee, and the Ruby Princess used to bob just off the shoreline out just not far from my place. And I realised, as the pandemic took off, the first phase was really about older rich white folks from boats like Ruby Princess, and lots of backpackers sniffing white powder and sharing $100 bills to do so. That was the sort of life of the East Coast, I guess, of Sydney. But I came out of a sort of multicultural arena. I'd worked on issues to do with poverty and displacement and so on. And I began to wonder what was actually happening. And one of the things that I discovered very quickly was that nobody had a clue what was really happening. Now, I think all of us as sociologists know if there's a data-free zone happening, then something is actually going on there, right? That people are constructively acting in ways to prevent knowledge being created. And the more I explored that, the clearer that actually became, that the ideas of powerlessness and injustice that I was exploring, they were really there. They were being exposed. And over a period of about a year, I got very actively involved in trying to create the possibility of data in this area. And this is sounds rather more nerdy, and in my case, a bit strange, given that wasn't really the pattern that I'd worked on when I was at university. But gradually it became clear to me that the impact of the pandemic was going to be quite dramatic on culturally on the culturally diverse communities of our cities, and that nobody was actually going to be able to track this because government in particular had decided that nobody was going to be allowed to track this, that the data that could be, that the opportunities to actually track what was going on would not be taken. And this happened in a number of different jurisdictions, a number of different contexts. There were a couple of guerrilla outbreaks, but basically that was the story. So, so I then thought, well, what will I do about this? I teamed up with some other people who were in the NGO sector, and we started to put pressure insofar as free floaters can put pressure on government. And finally, towards the end of last year, well after the committee advising on work, on sport, on Indigenous and everything else was created and were functioning more or less, the government created a committee to advise on cultural diversity and the pandemic. And despite an initial wriggle, when there was no way I was going to go anywhere, get anywhere near that, I was invited to join. And David will appreciate this, I was transformed from a sociologist into an expert epidemiologist, because the frame of reference on that committee didn't allow the concept of sociologists to be embedded in the knowledge models that they were using. And what happened next is a very interesting story, not necessarily to be discussed here in detail, but the outcome has been really quite dramatic and quite transformative. And from my point of view, has really demonstrated to me how important sociology in the public arena is in opening up both questions and the possibility of answers around these sorts of issues. So that was, in a sense, that was my volunteer effort, and that continues. The second part of it, though, was, and I made some brief mention of this, the second part of this, though, was the idea that the crisis actually produces opportunities. We know that for various corporations and so on, the pandemic has been extraordinarily valuable, extraordinarily successful. And I think some of my colleagues in other arenas of the social sciences have been tracking those. Deb Lupton, I think, for instance, has been is just producing a series of books around some of these questions. And I think they're going to be very, very interesting. But I took up, I guess, the opportunities for paid employment, not something that I'd thought about beforehand. First of these was an approach from Heidi Norman, who is a professor of Indigenous Studies at UTS, to work with her and an Indigenous research team on a media study of the way in which contemporary white nations actually construct First Nations histories in Australia and the political impact of that. That was an extremely powerful experience for me, very moving, and perfectly timed. The book was released, I think, the day before the first lockdown. So we timed that with great skill. But the project itself goes on, and Heidi and Amy Thomas, the two main people working on it, are continuing with that. I was then asked to lead a project on applying cultural diversity planning to a locality, in this case, Waverly. And it was a very strange exercise. As an individual, I thought I probably can't do this. So I went into the marketplace looking for private companies that I could do deals with or contract to take on this project, with me having, I guess, intellectual and philosophical control of the exercise, subject to the political exigencies of the council. That I found a very fascinating thing. It's very different from any sort of research I'd done before, because there's constant negotiations with all sorts of people, lots of interviews with people, lots of attempts to manage the intersection and the conflict between two great sort of waves of argument and theory, transculturalism and multiculturalism, and try and bring that down into something that would turn into something sensible. And I think, I'll put it up in a moment. I've got a link to that particular project that was launched a couple of weeks ago and is well underway. I've talked a bit about being a volunteer sociologist. And then early this year, in something the Closing the Circle, I was invited to take up a position as the senior advisor on cultural diversity to the Disability Royal Commission. And this is basically a huge project in which my whole professional and I guess theoretical career is being tested in the application in a particular set of studies around how does a multicultural society like Australia that claims to be so good come to grips with the fact that its practice in relationship to cultural diversity and disability, and in fact with the pandemic and many others, is absolutely so appalling. And so there's a constant sort of back conversation going on that I'm finding very, very interesting, given we're all working from home. So I'm now set up with 3 screens in my shed, and the world sort of is out there, and I have regular meetings, etc., etc. And I'm now working on a deadline to finish a report on what does cultural diversity tell us about disability in Australia, particularly in relationship to the violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation terms of reference that the Commission has. So, what does that suggest to me? It suggests to me, I think, a number of things. Firstly, I think we need to recognise, particularly in the academic environment, that the neoliberal attack on the social science, on science and on social science, is not going to go away. It's going to increase and become more intense. It was summarised for me by one of the IPA gunners, one of the IPA ideologues, who said, the only reason you have evidence is to back your ideology. And he is now, I think, a junior minister. And I think we're likely to see far more of that type of thing, right? That the ideology is there and only evidence that supports it will be allowed to find space. What that does to people who are independent researchers in universities, I think, will be very, very, very interesting. Secondly, something I think we're all aware of, part of the reason I think the sociology is under so much threat is obviously because the sociological community in the academy is under attack and is being squeezed. But something I think that Catherine's going to talk about is, bizarrely, and that's what I found in the private sector, there is a huge rising demand for sociological capacity in the private and government sector. It's not like they want sociologists. They want people who can do stuff that turns out to be sociology. And I think that's a very powerful reminder that even though some of the institutional bases and frameworks in which we've lived our lives, and I've spent 50 years in academia, I can barely believe I'm saying that, but that whole period, I've seen the rise and the transformation of sociology in the Australian academic environment and more widely in Australian society. And I think probably finally, I think the recognition that sociologists have an opportunity, and I would argue, coming out of that particular tradition, a responsibility to play a role as public intellectuals, not simply to seek out the protections that and the opportunities that are provided by institutions such as the universities, but that the very nature of sociological knowledge demands an engagement with the wider social forces that I guess are, you could say, sort of seeking to erode the insights, perspectives and values that sociology brings to civilization, if I can put it in such grand terms. So I'm going to finish there and hand over to my extremely competent and very interesting co-presenter.
I feel under so much pressure. Thank you, Andrew. It's interesting hearing you speak because even though as you said, our sort of trajectories have been quite different. I can see lots of parallels in my thinking reflected in what you've said. So I think it's interesting to make those connections. What I plan to do is speak on three different things. I'll firstly just give a briefer introduction to my career, because I think that gives some context to what I'm about to speak about. I'm then going to talk about my reflections on the differences between what I'll label applied sociology and a more academic sociology. And the third thing I'll do is actually just give you almost a list of some of the things that I think make sociologists employable in the private, government, NGO sectors. From my experience. Obviously, different people will have different experience on this. I have particular sets of values that have meant I have not worked in some places that other people may be finding very interesting to work in. So it's very much a perspective on this question. So I actually started in an arts management career. I did a totally practical undergraduate degree on stage production and production management, and worked for about 15, 17 years in the theatre, in the music sector, organising stuff, and gradually becoming, I guess, more senior and doing more administrative grant application writing, that sort of thing. And when I was in my mid-30s, I went back to uni, I think really for the first time, because my undergraduate degree was so intensely practical. I started out with a master's in international studies and social inquiry. I became very interested through the, I guess, capstone part of the degree that required you to do a research project in research and in policy. So I did a second master's in social policy and evaluation. And from that, ended up finding that I didn't really struggle to get work. I spent about 10 years in government and not-for-profit organisations doing a mixture of policy, advocacy and research work. I sometimes worked, the whole time I had my own consultancy. So I was in and out of jobs where I worked directly with clients. But then I also spent a very formative 3 years at one of the research centres at UTS in Sydney, which is really a commercial research consultancy, but embedded within the university structure, but doing commercially orientated research work. So for government and not-for-profits, very applied social research and evaluation projects. Then I wanted to keep growing. So I decided doing a PhD was a really good idea. And it actually was. I mean, there was moments of extreme stress and, discomfort, don't get me wrong. But on the whole, it was a great experience, in large part because, as I'll talk about it a bit more, for the first time I got to do research on my own terms about something I was interested in, not something that the client needed that they were interested in. I always thought I would return to doing applied social science or applied sociology on finishing the PhD, but I have really enjoyed academic and more theoretical work, and I've been successful in achieving a postdoc, which will start next year. So I think for now I'm in academia. So I have I ended up doing work before my PhD that was research focused, but with a really strong influence in how research influences policy and advocacy development for social justice. So sociology for social change. I'll also say that the work that I've done has, except for that UTS period, has really been contract work. So different companies, different jobs, different hiring policies for different lengths of time, often overlapping. Now, for me, that didn't feel as precarious as my last 18 months of academic casual work has felt. And I think that's because, as Andrew intimated, there's just so much more work outside of academia that you can, my experience was, I could just easily move from one job to another, whereas over the last 18 months, I've felt I've been really scrabbling for work and for crumbs off other people's tables. So it's been a very different experience of casual work and of contract work, and I would say less precarious outside of the academy from my experience. So in terms of differences, the big difference, I think, between academic or pure research, if that's really a thing, and applied research outside the academy, is the centrality of being able to answer, so what? You produce this work, you generate this knowledge, but so what? What does it mean? What are the implications? Because typically the work you're doing is close to policy, it's close to practice, and the people that you're working with or for actually want to know, yeah, but what do I do differently? Or what can I understand is working? Or what does the evidence base tell me is the best way to be doing X, Y, Z? So there's a real, really strong focus on being able to connect evidence and knowledge to the applied focus, the answering the question of so what does it mean? The second thing is that there's a different kind of, I think, degree and nature of constraints on your work outside of the academy. So typically you don't decide what it is you're researching or which area of policy you're going to be doing a literature review about or whatever. Those things are decided for you by the client. Sorry, just a moment. You also don't get to make a lot of the same number or quality of decisions along the way, which is why the PhD was great, because it felt incredibly self-indulgent and to be doing effectively my own work for the first time in 10 years rather than what someone else had asked me to do. But it brings up a very interesting difference, I think, between doing your own work in academia, where you've potentially got more flexibility about what you do and more decision-making capacity, and outside in the applied world, because values become so much more important. The type of organisation you're working for matters. Are they not-for-profit or profit? If they're government, are they local government, Commonwealth or state? They're very, very different beasts, and depending on who's in power politically, they're very different beasts. Is it a big, large NGO that is reliant on government contracts to a large degree for their funding? Or is it a really small not-for-profit or social enterprise who's really connected to their community and really hungry to make a difference and to have the evidence that gives them a better bang for their buck because they don't have much, so they want to be more secure in what they're doing? And the discrepancy often between your own personal values and ideologies and those in which you're being asked to work can be quite confronting. And there were some jobs where it was very confronting for me to know what to do with that tension or that conflict. And that's something I think that depending on where you end up working can come up, particularly if you do have a sort of political sociology kind of social change driver that has brought you to wanting to understand why the world is the way it is and how you might change it. That can bring you in conflict with your clients or with your employers in a way that is quite different to within the university. Even if you're working as an RA, as a research assistant for someone, it's more likely that you're going to have some more similarities of view than potentially in a government or external organisation. There are also different kinds of time and particularly budgetary pressures. Without wanting to reinforce stereotypes, I found working back in the university sector with people who perhaps are more used to how universities have typically worked, that there's been a real difference in capacity to project manage, meet deadlines, manage time, really consider budgets, where in the private sector, you typically just don't have that luxury, and you have to learn to meet those deadlines, make the compromises, find the ways of doing things within the budget of people and time and resources that you have available. The last thing I'll say on this sort of the difference or the constraints is that really the private sector does not pay you to do peer-reviewed publications or go to conferences if you want to also be kicking goals in a potential academic future possibility for yourself. And I was going to say, so, you end up doing it on your own time, but you probably do in academia to a larger degree than in the past anyway. So, yeah, but the publications I got along the way that helped me get a PhD scholarship, that helped me get work in academia, were ones that I did on my own time. And that requires just a certain amount of sort of strategic planning because of ethics and all of those sorts of things. Role of theory is obviously a big difference between these sort of more applied and more academic environments. I actually would argue that theory is just as important in the way you are working as a sociologist in both environments. It's just that your client may not see it so overtly as perhaps you have to show it in a peer-reviewed publication, for example, or when you're presenting at a conference. But the capacity of theory to help you move beyond description to something that's more theoretical and more generalizable is actually, I think, vital for good policy and program development and evaluation research. Not everyone would agree with me, but this is my perspective. I think theory actually has a place in applied work as much as it does in academic work. It's just that maybe in the outputs of your research, it looks more like metaphor, but it still plays a really central role, I think, in how your brain works and how it interprets and works with data, how it thinks about the knowledge that you are using to create whatever it is that your client or your employer wants you to do. And again, this is a connection to the so what. I think it's very, very hard to move from descriptive data to answering, yes, so what does it mean, without moving into theory or without having theoretical grounding that enables you to see some of those connections between what is in your data, perhaps more concrete, and what needs to be more abstracted to enable you to answer those bigger, more general questions of, yes, but what does it mean? What should we do? At a more aggregated level, rather than at the level of just those people who maybe were the data source for what you have in front of you. I'm talking a lot about research because most of the work that I've done, even when it's been policy and advocacy, has had a very, very strong research focus, whether that's working with existing academic and grey literature or whether it's collecting primary data. I still think of all of this as being a research process of interacting with evidence to deliver new knowledge in some way. The other thing is that I'm a very realist-informed researcher in terms of my sort of philosophy of science. And so the questions of for whom, why, in what contexts, when do things don't happen, how do things interact, they're all actually really important to me, and I think are very helpful ways of thinking about the world and the so what answer. But all of that may not necessarily be visible to a client. Because what they're interested in is something perhaps more concrete, more specific. But I think in defending the conclusions that you draw, having this sort of background is very, very helpful, which is why I think actually sociologists can do very, very well in government policy, advocacy, and the not-for-profit sector, because we bring this way of thinking to the work that we do, which lifts it from the descriptive. So in terms of getting a job, what do I think makes a sociologist employable outside of academia? Having a broad selection of skills, research skills and ways of thinking that you develop and that you know how to frame them, to sell them as something that is useful to people. Be a bowerbird of research methods. Having basic descriptive quantitative skills is really, really valuable. I'm not talking regression modeling. I'm talking being able to use Excel, being able to use Table Builder, which is what the Australian Bureau of Statistics uses as one of their interfaces between their data tables and clients like us. Being able to do basic frequency distributions and crosstabs using SPSS will get you jobs, because lots of people can't. Being able to interpret that data, being able to use the appropriate chart to represent that data, and being able to talk about it in a way that communicates an interpretation of what you're seeing in the numbers, are all really, really valuable things that will get you work. And I'd say if you've primarily been doing qualitative or literature-based work so far, that doing a short course to get yourself up to speed on some of this basic quantitative descriptive work actually will make you more employable, definitely. Think about when you're doing literature reviews, what the purpose of them are. I think you should be doing this anyway in academic work. When you're doing a literature review, why are you choosing the literature you're choosing to profile? Because it has a purpose in setting up the question, the analysis framework, the way that you frame your conclusions, all of those things. But it's even more important in the world outside of academia, that when you do literature reviews, it's not just a question of synthesizing what is currently known, but using that to also be really specifically answering the questions that your client or your employer has. Having a knowledge of the policy cycle is really, really helpful, because a lot of the jobs that I've been involved with have intersected with policy and programming. So just doing some basic reading on terminology around the policy cycle and some of the different theories about, to understand what happens when policy decisions are made is really helpful. There's a lot of work in evaluation, and that's a particular kind of applied social science where you're making judgments about the effectiveness, quality, appropriateness, etc. of a program or a policy. But there's lots of commercial work available doing evaluation. There's lots of positions embedded in not-for-profit and non-government organisations that are evaluative in their focus. So if you have an opportunity to investigate evaluation and it appeals to you, this is an area where there's work. There's always also research work in market research. I haven't done that, it's not my interest, but there's a lot of people I know who have found that a very interesting way to apply what they do as sociologists. Having skills in project management, being able to budget, think strategically, manage teams, develop leadership capacities, those are all things that will also help you, that you develop over time and make you more competitive. Being able to do good grant applications, do good job applications are all great foundational pieces for learning how to respond to the requests for tender and request for quotes, which is the main way that a lot of this consultancy work is given to people. So being able to effectively answer the job ad that is in the form of a request for quote or request for tender. Good communication skills are really important, and I mean being able to write to different audiences, to facilitate workshops, and to have what I call a consultant attitude, which to me means being confident to tell the story, coming across as being trustworthy, certain but still truthful in the context of complexity and what is unknown, being respectful of politics. But there's just something about being able to engender a sense of, you know what you're talking about, you can be trusted, that you can be part of the conversation with them and bring expertise to the table, which I think is actually, it's a sort of a personality thing that I think you can learn. But it is, I think, part of the picture of what makes someone successful in the environment that I'm talking about. And the last thing I'll say is develop networks. By that, I mean, tell people what you do when you meet them in whatever context. I know that sounds a bit weird, but my first evaluation job was because the sister of a flatmate had heard through him that I'd just finished a course in evaluation as part of my master's. and she only had $7,000 for an evaluation. And so she needed someone who was prepared to do something for very little money in order to get runs on the board. So we had we mutually exploited each other in a way, if that makes sense. We took advantage of each other's vulnerability, like what we each needed, and we made it work. And that got me runs on the board. And there's been lots of other times where people I've met through one employer have ended up being a source of work in the future. So I guess what I would say is treat everyone you work with now, as well as in the future, as a potential future client or employer, because you just don't know where the opportunities are going to come from, or what little thing is going to end up being the 3-year contract you have at UTS, for example. And the very, very last thing I'll say is that applied work could be your pathway back to academia, if in fact academia is where you want to be, because the postdoc fellowship that I've just been given, a big part of my success was being able to talk about the buzzwordy things like implementation and impact and industry from a perspective of really understanding what it is that industry needs from research and how to do that process of translation to ensure impact. So it may actually be that getting outside of academia gives you the kinds of skills and the capacity to communicate in different ways and extends your skills and your experience to make you actually more competitive than people who've stayed there the whole time. And I just want to make a plug also for TASA has an applied sociology thematic group, which I'm a part of, and there's lots of people working in all different kinds of environments who associate themselves as sociologists. And if you want to drop into some of our monthly meetings, it's an interesting place to hear about what opportunities there may be, what's needed, how people work, and just, I guess, maybe broaden your perspective on what is possible outside of the academy as a sociologist. Thank you very much. Oh, thanks, Anne.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Catherine and Andrew. Are there any questions forthcoming? Oh, yes, David. And then, yes, David.
Mute.
I'm off. I'm on that. That was actually a thank you thumb up rather than a question. But I can say something if you'd like. now that I've got the floor. Thanks very much to you both. It's a really interesting area to work in. I'm like Andrew. I'm now an emeritus, but for a lot of my academic life, I've done research consultancies and that kind of thing, and I'm still doing them. And we've been doing stuff around Sydney, looking at cultural infrastructure with the various local governments, Sydney, Parramatta, Inner West, Penrith, etc. So it's been quite an experience. I think that you raise a number of both the positive and negative dimensions of this kind of activity. And I just wondered if you'd say something about intellectual property. I know it's a bit boring, but one of the things that we've tried to do, admittedly we're going through a university, but it is an external contract, is to, as far as possible, turn at least some of our work into not necessarily peer-reviewed research, but you can put it up as a report or something like that. And once it goes digital, you get quite interesting responses. I had no idea that people would read some of our work in Kenya, for example, but they found it of interest. So but that does involve quite a lot of hard negotiation, because many of the people you want to deal with don't want to give up their intellectual properties. They see it, they're paying for it. It's their knowledge, not yours.
I'll jump into that first, if you don't mind, Andrew. I must admit that for my own work, so for the consultancy work that I did, I found that perhaps easier to negotiate because it was a much more interpersonal rather than interinstitutional relationship in some respects. However, that was not the work that typically became the peer-reviewed publications, because typically it didn't go through a proper authorised ethics approval system. It went through something that I would establish with the client. But when I was embedded in universities, that was something that was done at a higher level. I know that there was there was toing and froing between the centre in which I was working, the legal department at that university, and the client, and that it depended on the nature of the project. So there were some projects where reports ended up becoming public, and there was some where they didn't. Typically they didn't when they were evaluations, but they more often did when they were other forms of social research. And there were some projects where we were able to actually do an appropriate ethics process and develop peer-reviewed publications as well as the research reports, which then had a different kind of life. But same thing, you know, I still get I get occasional notifications on reports that I wrote 10 years ago from places in South America or Africa, where they're going through the equivalent of local government mergers and amalgamations, and that was something I wrote about when I was working more for local government. So it's a complicated issue, because I think ethics is as much a part of that discussion as the intellectual property in a way, and also what you're able to do as an employee of a university compared to as an individual. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think it's something that should be part of the discussion all the time, because you want that flexibility.
Thank you. Thanks, Kath.
Yeah, David, thanks for that question. And I was just trying to think about the 3 projects I'm currently involved in, each of which has their own layer of secrecy wrapped around them. The one with the pandemic, there was a meeting, I think last week, where I negotiated with the chair of the committee that I would be allowed to talk about the fact that certain things had happened, but I would not be allowed to talk about the content of those facts. Which is a very interesting dynamic, because I'm sort of screaming to get hold of this data and use it in a sort of sociological context, but ethically I'm bound not to. The second one, the Waverly Project, which is similar to some of the things I think that you've done, there was a sort of series of informal negotiations on that, because that was done through a private consultant. I did a partnership with a private consultant who managed the process. Right? There's no specific constraint there other than an agreement that I would show anything I wanted to publish privately or separately, and that I would be circumspect about the information that was provided to me in confidence as part of that process, and not release that in ways which might embarrass any of the participants. Right? So I'm aware of that sort of constraint. The third one, which I'm turning my eyeballs in, which is the disability one, they want to publish that as it comes, this material I'm writing. They want that to be published. It's one of the commitments of the Commission is that they want to leave a knowledge legacy as well as the findings. Right? So as well as the sort of, the practical issues that they're addressing in terms of their terms of reference, they have a very strong commitment to the idea that the field of knowledge that they're working in is so vacant of good information and good assessment and good analysis that, given the millions of dollars that are being invested in knowledge creation for the Commission, it would be unacceptable not to make that material available to the public. Right? always protecting the privacy, obviously, of the individuals who are concerned. So I think that's there are different sorts of contexts. But I know that I was also triggered to remember one particularly difficult consultancy I did with a colleague many moons ago, which produced a report called Equal Disappointment Opportunity, which was a study of cultural diversity in what was then the new Commonwealth Department of Community Services. And we said as part of our methodology at the outset that the knowledge produced by interaction with people in the community was their knowledge and should be released to them as part of the process. And the client, as the knowledge became more acerbically critical and more revelatory of its not very good work, became less and less comfortable about that process. That ended up with, I think, a situation where we were handed the copyright on the condition we placed a statement in the front of the report, which is now, it's in the National Library, that said this was not the view of the government. Right? So that was quite acerbic. And a final version of that, the project I did some years ago for whatever it was, Home Affairs, Immigration, whatever particular name it was wearing at the time. During there was a moment in the Labor period of government where they said, why don't we go out there and find out some data about what's actually going on? We were allowed to publish that report and papers from it as long as we made no reference to any of the recommendations in the report, because the bureaucrats were concerned that if there were recommendations that were well-founded and nothing was done about them, they might be held to account. And more particularly, their political masters might be asked questions which were uncomfortable. And therefore, they would prefer, if we wish to proceed to use this data, it was absolutely fascinating material, then they shouldn't be implicated in any responsibility for doing anything about it. I don't know if that fits, Catherine, with some of your experiences.
Just hearing you talk about the politics is a grave error or grave lapse in my overview. When I was talking about values, politics is such a big part of it. The big P politics, but also the little p politics that happens within workplaces and in those interactions that you have with people, and people's fears about the impact of the work that you do on them and on their career progression are very real. And all of that negotiation is a big part of doing contract work, or consultancy work, I should say.
I think that's right.
Perhaps, Catherine, I might ask you a question. Unfortunately, it relates to money. You did a $7,000 consultancy. Did that keep you in poverty, or?
No, look, I actually found that the work that I cobbled together made me no worse off than when I was working as operations manager for Brandenburg Orchestra. So in neither case is this total income going to set the world on fire or in any way compete with, the financial sector, or even a full-time university position at, a level B or something. But it was plenty, and it was really enjoyable work, and I really liked it. Now, if you get into a consultancy that is a more, PricewaterhouseCoopers, whatever, all of the big accounting firms that have now got social science, social consultancies, social policy consultancies, they pay better, but it's a trade-off. So I loved doing the work with the little NGOs and little social enterprises that didn't have a huge amount of money, but who really, really valued it. And I loved the opportunity to meet some extraordinary people who are sort of, as they say, at the coalface of inequality and social justice work, and support that work. So no, I mean, the $7,000 example was very much, that was the first job I ever did as an evaluation consultant. And, you know, they had received funding where it said 10% of the funding has to be an evaluation. So they needed an evaluation. But that's not the case for everything. And, you know, if you do work for local government, it'll pay differently to if you do work for state or federal government. And if you're working within a consultancy, your per hour charge out rate will be a lot higher than what I was able to offer as my per hour charge out rate, which makes you more competitive. But it doesn't mean that I, as an individual, had less money on my tax return at the end of the year. It's just that my overheads were less because 30% of my charge out rate didn't have to go back to covering on costs and all of the other, you know, all that stuff. So I had no problem making a living and feeling very happy about what I was earning for the work that I was doing. It was still, as an hourly rate, so much higher than what most people get paid, quite frankly. So, you know, I think, Roger, the answer is it depends. It depends a lot on what your bigger life objectives are around money. But no, for me, it was absolutely fine.
I have a couple of anthropology friends who make a very good living from consultancy work, and you know, their charge out rate at the moment is something like $1,250 to $1,500 a day. And I imagine, as certainly a starting out consultant, you wouldn't be able to charge anywhere near that.
No, and it depends who your clients are and who you want your clients to be.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, as I said, if you go into one of the especially one of the big accountancy firms, it's a different ballgame. But it's also then a different value proposition as well.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you can't have an impact on those values. I mean, I still think that having my politics and my sort of attitudes about, you know, what the nature of the world is and social complexity and social problems, and that there are structural as well as individual factors that interplay when we talk about social problems. Actually having those sorts of conversations did help to change some cultural prejudice about, you know, individuals being at fault for their own failure, that sort of very neoliberal thing. So I think, you know, you can go into environments that perhaps are a little bit more challenging ideologically and have an impact as a sociologist to bring structure back into the question, for example. That's something I feel quite strongly about.
Okay, now David's got a question, and then if we've got time, I might ask you another question about basic statistics and so forth. Thanks, David.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I don't want to take it if anyone else has got a question, but seems not. To get a bit Bourdieusian for a moment, I think it's quite, we were talking about the relationship between kind of legitimate academic knowledge and credentials and that kind of thing, and the work that you're doing sort of, you know, in that sphere, in applied and consultancy sphere. I actually think that in a way, well, quite clearly, your kind of orthodox academic accomplishments provide you with the necessary cultural and economic capital to give you legitimacy as a consultant, or, you know, as an applied sociologist. I think without that, you might say I'm a sociologist, but, you know, they kind of want, I found people want, you know, want to have some kind of, you know, measure, some kind of objective measure, as they would see it, of your accomplishments in other areas. And the other thing I'd like to say just quickly is, I find myself, I think I've said this before in a couple of meetings, I find myself being contacted by marketing firms, sometimes advertisers, sometimes legal firms, kind of weird connections, but it's kind of paid in that in the sense that you might get an honorarium, like a very expensive bottle of wine or something like that. And I don't know whether I'm selling my soul to the devil, but it's they actually listen to my wildest, you know, gross generalizations. quite closely, and with respect you would never get from your academic colleagues. So that can be quite good fun. I don't know if either of you have those experiences sometimes.
It's very funny. You made the comment, David, that I've just been elected to the Academy of Science. This morning, I received a small hamper from the Academy as a kind of welcome, and I'm immediately drawn to the sociology of the content of the hamper. Right. And it was really, it's really quite, I won't embarrass myself or anyone else by talking it through in too much detail, but you can see in this little box of goodies a complete world of values in terms of what is seen to be an appropriate welcome into an organisation, which I've got to say is fairly white, not as male as it used to be, but not diverse really, except for a few outliers. And the content is, it's a bit like, I guess, because I don't know these things, because it's not part of my story, it's a bit like the sort of thing you'd have at a morning tea around Christmas at your maiden aunt. Right?
Shortbread.
So,
Shortbread.
Those sorts of things.
Off, yeah.
Little wrap biscuits with various flavoured creams and things like this. All the chocolate is milk, right? Etc. I mean, it is. I'm not being critical. It's just, it's like an introduction. I think your thing about interacting with corporates. Right. I mean, I've done similar sorts of things where you've ended up with an extremely nice bottle of wine, which, I mean, they probably, they probably buy it by the corporate crate rate, and they do listen to you. The question that then becomes what they do about it. I think Catherine's point is really important, that there's a conversational aspect to this, where you're engaging in a conversation, and part of your intent, I think, as a sort of a researcher or an academic, whatever you want to call it, is to move the mind frame of the person with whom you're engaging into a space where they appreciate the points that you're trying to make, and they own that knowledge. That is, their own knowledge base actually is transformed in some way. Right? And I'm thinking that, like, of the Waverly thing, one of the big issues about Waverly was it is a fairly white area, and it's putting together a cultural diversity strategy. Right? One of the things that we argued for was a project where the West would be welcomed to the East. Right? That is, that there would be a council to council or council to NGO strategy developed, where people from Western Sydney, particularly humanitarian refugee arrivals, settlers who'd never been anywhere near the East, would be welcomed through some process. The city of Sydney already does this in different ways, right? And for a council like that to take that on and say, we have a responsibility to share what we have with people who are very different from us, and who potentially many of our residents would not be very happy with us doing this for, right, is actually really important. Right? So I think those sorts of conversations, you're right, are really important. And it's about placing yourself in, I think Catherine's captured very well, you're placing yourself in the position of those with whom you're engaged, so that you understand the audience that you're trying to inveigle, I guess, into a worldview which may be quite foreign or marginally foreign to them before the process.
So just very quickly, I do know the hamper you're talking about. And I don't know if you've noticed, Andrew, but there's a bottle of French sparkling wine in there, but it's not champagne. It's the down market.
It's not French.
Sorry to disappoint you, but another close.
No, it's not French.
Hey?
It's not French.
Isn't yours French? Oh,
No.
the one I saw was Lanson, which is the down market French sparkling wine. That's
No. This is. I would have thought that the Academy would have done a French thing, given the current crisis.
Maybe it's all held up on boats and they couldn't get into the country because of supply chain issues.
All that stuff.
When you were talking, David, about, they only gave me a bottle of wine, but this was my sort of emotional response to being asked. I think that actually sums up a little bit why doing applied work with people you respect and admire, or with people where you really are having an impact on the work that they do, and therefore the potential outcomes of their clients, if it's in a sort of social justice space, is so intoxicating. Because you've got a much closer connection to the outcomes of the people who, well, for me at least, who are driving my work anyway, in an academic sense, as much as in an applied sense, but you're actually seeing some kind of connection. And it's very, very cool sitting in a meeting and presenting material in a way that's accessible to your audience, which is profoundly theoretical and profoundly challenging to the sort of, I guess, predominant discourses about that social problem, and seeing their eyes light up and their excitement at having a new way of framing and arguing for the clients for whom they work. That it is very cool, I will say.
Okay, perhaps on that note, we should leave it. We're getting up towards well past the hour. Not that that's a problem, but at some point, I guess we've got to close it off. And I'll talk to you later, Catherine, about the Excel issue. But first of all, I'd like to thank both Andrew and Catherine once again for your great presentation. And I think that this will be, it's not the beginning, but it certainly won't be the last that we see about discussions about applied sociology. So both of them were very interesting and thought-provoking, and I've taken some interesting notes, and it's really good to have these discussions. So thank you, and good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you both.
Great session.
Well
Cheers,
done.
guys. Bye.
See you.
Bye. Roger, if you want to ask me the question now for the purpose
sure.
of having it in the recording, I'm really happy. I've got time to stay on.
Okay. A number of weeks ago, Catherine Betts, a sociologist from Monash, was talking about her experience of doing applied work as well. And she was saying, for example, that SPS was costing her $167 or something of that nature a month, and she discovered a free
there are other options
alternative. And I was saying also, I used to teach students, and a lot of my students would end up working in NGOs and so forth, and I said it's most unlikely you're ever going to get a copy of SPSS. So Excel have this statistics package, and I introduced students to that, and I said it will do all the things that you were just talking about before, and some more even. And I think, any student, I think, should have some basic literacy in Excel anyhow.
Excel is ubiquitous. I find that for the basic statistical stuff, particularly if there's any thinking that you might develop it further, that you very quickly reach a threshold with Excel. The reason I mentioned SPSS is because it also is in a lot of organisations. It's in a lot of universities, in a lot of the government organisations, and a lot of the bigger NGOs will have a licence. But more and more people coming up, certainly through Macquarie, I don't know about other universities, but more and more students are being exposed to free software like R. And I think that's really good. Like,
how do you pronounce it? How do you spell that?
Oh, it's just the letter R.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a syntax-based statistical program that is open source, where you sort of download the module that you want to work with. There are also GUIs, like the graphical user interfaces, that you can use to make it easier and more sort of drop-down menu orientated if you're not so used to syntax-based programming. but it's free. And once you've got that initial learning curve out of the way, you know, it's relatively simple to use for basic stuff. But it's being able to do basic statistics. So my experience of Excel is that doing, you know, crosstabs with tests of association is hard. It's harder to do, and that it's harder to drive and make the choices you want to make. So having a program that is actually a statistics program that you learn how to use and that is recognized by employers. So if you can say, I have used SPSS for this, this, and this, or I have used Stata for this, this, and this, or I have used R for this, this, and this, people will then trust your capacity to use whatever program they have in-house, quite frankly, because most of them, once you've used one, you can kind of start moving between
they're
different, to a degree. I mean, a lot of people use SPSS without ever using the syntax, and then the learning curve, if you move to Stata, is obviously, or R is obviously greater. But the stuff I'm talking about is the really basic stuff, and it's things that you can go and learn if you have not learnt it as part of your degree, for example. So AXPRI, what is it, the Consortium for Social and Political something or other, run courses, and they do an introductory basic descriptive statistics course using SPSS. And it's a calling card if you want to get employment in, you know, it might not be that SPSS is a great way for you to do it if you are a private consultant working for yourself, although I made sure that I bought a perpetual license before I stopped being a student because of the discounts as a student, for example. But then learning Stata, it was much, much cheaper to buy Stata outright than it was to buy SPSS. So I ended up moving to Stata. Plus, it's just a different program and it does a lot of things better than SPSS at a more complex level. But at the basic level, just know how to do it. Know how to use Table Builder, which is completely free. Know how to use Excel, which everybody pretty much has access to for what Excel is able to do. And it's being able to do charts that you don't have more than 100% in a pie chart. You know, basic stuff like that. What is the difference between a frequency distribution and trend lines? Why would you use a bar chart rather than lines on a graph? That basic stuff will separate you as a sheep from the goats in employment terms, for sure. Because so many people look at numbers and freak out.
And that sort of thing's even been, I would in a sense like to go into marketing, so I've read a fair bit about it. And I mean, Edward Bernays actually published in the American Journal of Sociology back in the 1920s. But in design circles now, they talk about ways of presenting data, and you know, one woman says never use a pie chart, you know, like and
we'll never use one badly. Never use a 3D pie chart.
Unless you're the LNP, in which case it can add up to more than 100%.
Yeah, that's right. I think these things are all relative and it's all a spectrum. So, you know, if you currently have no quantitative statistical capacity or skill set, that getting even a little bit will give you a competitive edge over the many, many, many other people who have nothing. And if you find you have an aptitude for it and an interest in it, and it's getting you work and you want to explore it further, then you explore it further. So if all you do is go onto YouTube and learn how to use Excel, learn how to do charts in Excel, learn how to do pivot tables in Excel.
Yes.
If that's all you do, that will give you an edge. Go onto the ABS, get yourself a free Table Builder account and start playing with census data. That will give you an edge. Download some Excel spreadsheets from the Centrelink database that's on the Department of Human Services and play with them in Excel and ask yourself some questions. You know, of the people who receive the age pension, how many are women, how many are men? How many live in this particular socioeconomic CIFA area compared to others? And start, you know, how do I manipulate the data in Excel to produce a chart that shows me the comparative proportions or comparative distributions between these two groups. And that will put you ahead of a lot of other people who have never done that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for
No worries. Sorry to rant on at the end,
No,
but
no,
it made an incredible difference to my career, being able to do those basic things. And I mean, I then learnt how to do regression and other things, and that took me in other directions. But that basic stuff, it's gold.